human soldier mistreated the orc prisoner's only friend. She escaped and took revenge. There are sounds you learn to ignore in a dungeon. The drip of water finding its way through ancient stone. The distant screams of other prisoners who haven't yet learned that screaming changes nothing. The rattle of chains when you shift in your sleep. If you can call the unconsciousness that comes from exhaustion, sleep. But there was one sound Guthera never ignored. The soft, delicate chime of a bronze bell. It came every night, just after the guards finished their evening rounds. A gentle tinkling that grew louder as it approached her cell. The sound of a small brass bell tied to a worn leather collar, announcing the arrival of the only creature in this stone hell that didn't see her as a monster. Ember. The cat was the color of autumn leaves, with eyes like copper coins and a purr that vibrated through the bars when he pressed his small body against the iron. No one knew where he came from. Strays existed in every human city, slipping through cracks in walls, surviving on scraps and the occasional kindness of someone who remembered that not everything needed to be useful to deserve existence. Guthera had been in this cell for 4 months, 123 days to be exact. She counted them by scratching marks into the stone with a piece of her broken tusk, the right one, snapped off during her capture when 5 human soldiers decided that subduing her required breaking something first. The tusk had been a source of pride once. Her mother had taught her to carve it with symbols of their clan, the Iron Root tribe, known for standing firm when the world tried to uproot them. The carvings were gone now, just another thing this place had taken from her. But they hadn't taken Ember. The cat had appeared on her 32nd night. Guthera had been sitting in the dark, her hands chained to the wall in a position that made her shoulders scream after the first hour and go numb after the 4th. She'd heard the bell before she saw him, a sound so out of place in this world of iron and stone that she'd thought she was hallucinating. Then he'd walked into the thin beam of moonlight that managed to squeeze through the high window, and she'd seen him for the first time. Small, unconcerned, completely unaware that he was looking at a creature that could snap his spine with one hand. He'd meowed once, tilted his head, and walked straight to her cell. That first night, Guthera had stared at him like he was an apparition. Some trick of her mind, conjuring comfort where none existed. But Ember had rubbed against the bars, purring like he'd found exactly what he was looking for, and something inside Guthera's chest, something she'd thought the humans had successfully killed, cracked open. She'd reached through the bars with her chained hands. Her fingers, too large and rough for something so delicate, had touched his soft fur. Ember had purred louder. That was 4 months ago. Since then, Ember came every night. Sometimes he stayed for hours, sleeping just outside her reach, his breathing a rhythm that reminded her that living things could be peaceful. Sometimes he only visited for minutes before wandering off to whatever adventures cats pursued in the dead of night, but he always came. And he always wore that bell. Sister Aveline had put it there. She was the only human in this fortress who treated prisoners like they were still people. A young cleric with kind eyes and hands that shook when she handed bowls of thin soup through the bars, not from fear, but from anger at what she was forced to witness and couldn't change. "So I know where he is," she'd whispered to Guthera one evening, fastening the bell around Ember's neck. "So I can find him if he gets into trouble." Guthera had nodded. She understood. This world was dangerous for small, innocent things. Tonight, Ember arrived later than usual. Guthera had been sitting in the dark, listening to the sound of guards laughing somewhere above her. They were playing dice again, betting on how long prisoners would last. She'd heard them take bets on her once. Most gave her another month before she either went mad or stopped eating. They didn't understand orcs very well. Orcs didn't break the way humans expected. You could chain an orc's body, but their spirit was a different matter. It didn't shatter. It compressed. It waited. It remembered every injustice, catalogued every cruelty, and stored it all away for later. Guthera had a very long list by now. The bell chimed. She looked up. Ember squeezed through the gap at the bottom of her cell door. Someone had built these dungeons before they realized that cats didn't respect architecture, and immediately trotted over to her. He rubbed against her leg, his purr starting up like a small, contented engine. "Late tonight," Guthera murmured in Orcish, her voice rough from disuse. She only spoke to Ember now. There was no point talking to guards who saw her as a thing, or to other prisoners who'd stopped responding weeks ago. Ember meowed, which Guthera had learned meant approximately 7 different things depending on tone and context. This one meant, "I was busy, but I'm here now, and that's what matters." She smiled. It hurt her face. She didn't smile often anymore. Gothera had just managed to scratch behind Ember's ears, a maneuver that required precise angles given her chains, when she heard footsteps, not the usual guards doing their rounds. These were heavier, more deliberate, the kind of footsteps that meant someone was coming to your cell specifically, and it was never for good reasons. Ember's ears swiveled toward the sound. His purring stopped. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped outside her cell. Captain Lennox Corbett stood there holding a torch that painted harsh shadows across his face. He was the kind of man who wore cruelty like it was a military decoration, something he'd earned and was proud to display. 41 years of decisions that had slowly carved away anything decent, leaving only the satisfaction of power over those who couldn't fight back. Still alive, Orc? His voice had the casual tone of someone commenting on weather. Gothera said nothing. She'd learned that responding only encouraged him. Lennox's eyes drifted down to Ember. The cat had pressed himself against Gothera's leg, his small body tense. Something changed in Lennox's expression. A small smile, the kind that made Gothera's hands curl into fists. Made a friend, have you? Lennox stepped closer to the bars. Pathetic. Even the beasts find comfort with each other. The insult didn't touch Gothera. She'd heard worse. Been called worse. But the way Lennox was looking at Ember, like he'd just discovered something that could be used, made her blood turn cold. Captain. She spoke for the first time in 3 days, her voice hoarse. Leave him be. Oh, it speaks. Lennox's smile widened. Didn't realize you cared about anything, monster. Thought your kind only understood violence. Please. The word tasted like ash in Gothera's mouth. Begging. She was begging. But Ember was small and innocent, and had chosen to be kind when kindness was the rarest thing in the world. He's just a cat. Just a cat, Lennox repeated, like he was considering the philosophical implications. Then, faster than Gothera could process, he drove his boot through the bars. The kick was precise, practiced, the kind of cruelty that came from years of finding exactly the right amount of force to inflict maximum pain without killing. Ember's yowl of pain cut through the dungeon like a blade. The cat flew backward, hitting the opposite wall with a sickening thud. The bell around his neck rang once, a sharp, broken note that echoed off the stone, and then went silent. Ember lay still for a horrible moment. Then he scrambled to his feet, moving wrong, one leg dragging. He limped away into the darkness, leaving small spots of blood on the stone floor. The bell didn't ring. It hung crooked on his collar, dented and silent. Gothera couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stare at the blood spots while something inside her, the last piece of herself that had remained civilized, reasonable, willing to endure, shattered completely. That's what happens, Lennox said, his voice distant through the roaring in Gothera's ears, to things that forget their place. He walked away, his footsteps fading back into the darkness. Gothera sat in her cell, staring at nothing, her hands trembling with a rage so pure it felt like ice instead of fire. She'd endured her capture, endured the interrogations, endured the beatings, the starvation, the darkness, the chains, the humiliation. She'd endured because she'd told herself that survival was a form of resistance, that staying alive meant they hadn't won. But this was different. Ember had been innocent, had chosen to love when everything in this world taught creatures to hate, had seen an orc chained in darkness and decided that she deserved companionship anyway, and Lennox had hurt him, not for information, not for strategy, not for survival. He'd hurt him because he could, because cruelty was easier than kindness, because making something suffer felt like power. Gothera looked down at her chains. She'd tested them 100 times in 4 months. Good steel, well made, designed to hold creatures much stronger than humans, the kind of chains that said, "You're not escaping, so stop trying." She gripped them with both hands, and pulled. The chains didn't break. But something in Gothera's shoulders did. Tendons tearing, joints dislocating with pops. She felt more than heard. Pain screamed through her arms, bright and clarifying. She kept pulling. Blood ran warm down her wrists where the metal bit through her green skin. She pulled until the mounting bolt in the wall cracked, then broke, then came free, taking chunks of ancient mortar with it. Gothera sat there for a moment, her arms hanging useless at her sides, chains still attached but no longer connected to anything. Her shoulders were ruins. She'd need weeks to heal, and that was if she survived the next hour. She didn't care. She stood on legs that hadn't properly carried her weight in months, swaying like a tree in a storm. Her body screamed at her to sit back down, to rest, to stop destroying herself. She ignored it. The cell door was locked, but the lock was on the outside. Guthara wrapped her chain around the bars and pulled. Pain exploded through her damaged shoulders. She pulled harder. The old door frame, weakened by centuries of dampness, began to splinter. The wood gave before her body did. The door crashed open. Guthara stepped into the corridor, leaving bloody footprints on stone that hadn't seen her free shadow in 4 months. Somewhere above her, guards were laughing. Not for much longer. Sister Aveline was making her evening rounds when she heard the sound. At first she thought it was rats. The fortress had plenty, and they made all sorts of concerning noises when they fought over scraps in the dark. But rats didn't breathe like that. She raised her lantern and saw him in the thin circle of light, Ember, dragging himself along the corridor, leaving a small trail of blood. His breathing came in short, pained gasps. The bell on his collar hung silent and bent. Oh no. Aveline dropped to her knees, her medical training taking over before her fear could paralyze her. Oh, Ember. What happened? She knew what happened. She'd heard Captain Lennox's boots heading toward the dungeons, had seen that particular expression on his face, the one that meant he was bored and looking for something to hurt. Her hands shook as she examined Ember. Broken ribs, certainly, maybe internal bleeding, the kind of injuries that killed small animals slowly and painfully. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "I'm so sorry I brought you here. I thought showing kindness would help. She thought kindness mattered in a place like this." Ember meowed weakly, like he was trying to comfort her. Aveline gathered him as gently as she could, cradling his small body against her chest. She needed to get him to her quarters, needed to try every healing prayer she knew, even though she'd never been particularly good at them. Her real talent was in seeing suffering and being unable to look away, a terrible gift in a world that produced suffering like crops grew from soil. She was halfway to the stairs when she heard it. The sound of metal screaming, wood splintering, and something very large moving through the dungeon with purpose. Aveline froze. She should run, should get Ember to safety, should not investigate sounds that clearly indicated something catastrophically wrong was happening in a place designed to keep catastrophically wrong things from happening. She turned toward the sound anyway. That's when she saw her. Guthara emerged from the darkness like a nightmare given form. Blood covered her arms and chest. Her chains dragged behind her, still attached to her wrists but no longer attached to anything else. Her shoulders hung at wrong angles. Her eyes were the color of amber lit from within, and they held a focus that Aveline had only seen once before, in a hunting cat the moment before it struck. "Sister Aveline." Guthara's voice was rough, each word carved from gravel. "Where is he?" It wasn't a question. "He's..." Aveline looked down at Ember in her arms. "I'm taking him to get help. He's hurt badly." "I know." Guthara took a step forward. Blood dripped from her wrists. "Lennox did it." Aveline nodded slowly. There was no point lying. "He's in the officers' hall," Aveline said quietly, "playing dice, like he does every night." Guthara's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around her. The temperature seemed to drop. "You should take Ember and leave," Guthara said. "What happens next isn't for kind eyes to witness." "I can't stop you." Aveline's voice shook. She was holding an injured cat and facing an orc who'd just torn herself free from chains designed by master smiths. She had no weapons, no power here. "But I can ask, what will this achieve? You kill him. They kill you. You know this." "I know." Guthara looked at Ember. Something in her expression softened. But he hurt something innocent because he could, because causing pain felt like power. "If I let that stand, then this world teaches cruelty and punishes kindness. And I won't survive in a world like that anyway." She met Aveline's eyes. "So I choose to make it mean something. I choose to show that hurting the innocent has consequences, even if the consequence is me." Aveline opened her mouth to argue, to plead, to find words that would stop what was about to happen. But Guthara was already moving past her, chains rattling with each step, her shadow stretching long across the stone walls as she climbed the stairs toward the sound of laughter. Aveline stood in the darkness, holding Ember, listening to the ticking of the damaged bell. "May the gods forgive us all," she whispered. Then she ran. The officers' hall was warm, smoky, and filled with the kind of careless joy that came from men who'd never faced consequences for their actions. Dice clattered on the wooden table. Coins changed hands. Jokes were told at the expense of people who couldn't defend themselves. Captain Lennox Corbett sat at the head of the table, winning more than he lost because the men under his command knew better than to beat him. The door exploded inward. Guthera stood in the doorway, backlit by torches from the corridor, looking like something that had crawled out of every nightmare humans told about orcs. Blood covered her. Chains hung from her wrists. Her breath came in short, controlled bursts, the breathing of someone managing pain so intense it would have dropped a normal person. The laughter stopped. Lennox stared at her, and for just a moment, just one beautiful, clarifying moment, Aveline saw fear in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the performance of command. "Guards! Seize her!" Two men moved, then stopped when Guthera took a single step forward, and they realized that she wasn't running, wasn't desperate, wasn't panicked. She was hunting. "You heard him," Guthera said quietly. Lennox stood, hand going to his sword. It was a cat, a vermin. It meant nothing. It meant everything. Guthera's voice was still quiet, quieter than it should be, quiet like the moment before thunder. It was the only kindness I'd seen in 4 months, the only creature that looked at me and didn't see a monster. It chose to be gentle in a place of violence. She took another step forward, and you heard it. You heard it because you could, because cruelty felt easier than walking away. Sergeant Pike Drummond stood in the corner, his hand moving to his sword, then stopping, then moving again, then stopping again. He cleaned his blade nervously. Always did that when he was lying to himself about what the right choice was. "Someone stop her!" Lennox's voice had lost its command tone. Now it just sounded like fear trying to sound like anger. But none of the guards moved, because they'd all done the math. Guthera had torn free of chains that had held her for months. She'd broken through a locked door. She'd climbed stairs with dislocated shoulders and was still standing. Whatever was about to happen was so far above their pay grade it might as well be occurring on a different plane of existence. Guthera crossed the room in 3 strides. Lennox drew his sword. She slapped it out of his hands like it was a toy. "You're going to kill me," Lennox said. Not a question. An observation. "You're going to kill me, and they'll hunt you down, and you'll die too. You know this. You're throwing your life away for a cat." "No." Guthera grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground with her ruined arms, her face a mask of controlled fury. "I'm throwing my life away for the idea that causing pain should have consequences. That even in a world this broken, someone should say, 'This far and no further.'" She looked at the other men in the room. "You all watched. You all knew what he was. You all let it happen because it was easier than standing up. You made this world cruel through cowardice." She looked back at Lennox, who was clawing at her hand, his face turning purple. "I'm going to give you one chance," Guthera said softly. "One chance that no one gave Ember, or me, or any of the others in those cells. I'm going to let you choose." She lowered him until his feet touched the ground, her hand still around his throat. "You can apologize. You can mean it. You can spend the rest of your life trying to be better than what you are, and I'll walk away." Lennox gasped for air. "Or you can stay exactly what you are, and I'll make sure you never hurt another innocent thing again." The room held its breath. Lennox's hand went for the knife at his belt. Guthera's grip tightened, and in that moment she saw it in his eyes. He wasn't sorry, wouldn't be sorry, couldn't even conceive of being sorry because in his mind, he'd done nothing wrong. The cat was an animal. The orc was a monster. Nothing he did to either mattered because they weren't people in any way that counted. That's when Guthera understood. Some people couldn't be saved because they didn't think they were broken. "Then you've chosen," she said quietly. What happened next was quick, efficient, the kind of violence that came from someone who'd been trained as a warrior since childhood, who understood exactly how much force was needed and where to apply it. When it was over, Captain Lennox Corbett would never hurt anything again. Guthera dropped his body and turned to face the other guards. They stared at her. She stared back. "Anyone else?" Her voice was steady, despite the pain that must have been screaming through her entire body. Sergeant Pike Drummond slowly lowered his sword. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I think we're good." The other guards nodded. Several looked relieved. One was openly crying. Guthera walked toward the door. Each step looked like it cost her. Blood dripped from her wrists. Her shoulders hung at angles that made Aveline's medical training scream. She paused at the doorway. "I'm going to die," she said matter-of-factly. "They'll send hunters, soldiers. They'll put my head on a wall somewhere as a warning. Fine. But when they do, when they tell stories about the orc who escaped and killed a captain, I want you to tell them why." She looked at each man in turn. Tell them I did it for a cat. Tell them I did it because someone showed me kindness and paid for it with pain. Tell them I chose vengeance over survival because the only thing worse than dying is living in a world where causing suffering has no consequences. She turned to leave. Wait. The voice was quiet. Sister Aveline stepped into the doorway, still holding Ember. You can't just wander off to die. Your shoulders are destroyed. You're losing blood. You won't make it past the gates. Gothera smiled, and it was the saddest thing Aveline had ever seen. I know. Then let me help you. Aveline's voice was firm. Let me give you a chance. Please. Ember would want that. Gothera looked at the small cat in Aveline's arms. Ember's eyes were barely open, but his tail twitched weakly when he saw her. Something in Gothera's expression cracked. Why? Her voice was barely a whisper. Why show me kindness now? Because Ember did, Aveline said simply. And because if the world teaches that kindness gets punished and cruelty goes unchallenged, then we've already lost. Help me prove that wrong. Let me heal you. Let me give you a chance to escape. Let something good come from this. Gothera stood there, swaying slightly. A warrior who'd given everything for a single moment of justice and now had nothing left but pain and the promise of death. What about them? She gestured to the guards. Sergeant Pike Drummond cleared his throat. We were playing dice, sister. Heard a commotion. By the time we got here, the captain was already dead. Never saw who did it. Could have been anyone with a grudge. He had plenty. The other guards nodded slowly. One even managed a barely concealed smile. Dark night, Pike continued. Hard to see. Easy to miss things. Aveline looked at Gothera. There's a passage, old smuggler's route that leads out past the walls. I can get you to it. Get you supplies. After that I run. Gothera finished. Run until they catch me or I find somewhere they won't follow. Or, Aveline said carefully, you heal. You survive. You find others like you who were hurt by people like Lennox. And you build something better. Gothera laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You think one orc can change anything? No. Aveline stepped closer. But one orc who chose justice over revenge, who could have torn this fortress apart but chose to make one man face consequences instead, who risked everything for a cat. That orc might start something, might make others think twice, might show that even in the darkest places, someone will stand up and say, this far and no further. Ember meowed weakly. The bent bell around his neck rang softly, damaged but still functioning. Gothera reached out with her ruined hands and gently touched the cat's head. Ember purred, a fragile sound in the violent silence. Get me to your passage, Gothera said finally. Give me supplies to last a week. After that, I'm on my own. Agreed. Aveline looked at the guards. You saw nothing. Saw less than nothing. Pike confirmed. Captain must have had enemies we didn't know about. Tragic, really. He was he was exactly what he was. The guards filed out, already constructing their official story, already choosing the version of events that let them sleep at night without admitting they'd stood by while cruelty happened and only found their courage when someone else forced their hand. Aveline led Gothera through the darkness, supporting as much of the orc's weight as she could manage. Behind them, the officers' hall stood empty except for a body and overturned dice that had stopped mid-roll, frozen in the moment when casual cruelty met its consequence. The smuggler's passage was exactly what you'd expect from something built by people who needed to move illegal things without being seen. Narrow, dark, and smelling like decades of poor decisions. Aveline had found it during her first month at the fortress, cataloging escape routes because she'd learned early that places like this required exit strategies. She'd stashed supplies here over months. Blankets, food, bandages, a small amount of coin, water. The kind of things you gathered when you knew, someday, you'd help someone escape. Now she worked quickly, wrapping Gothera's shoulders, setting them as best she could with prayers that probably wouldn't work because healing magic had never been her strong suit. The orc bore it silently, her jaw clenched so tight, Aveline worried teeth might crack. Ember lay on a folded blanket nearby, his breathing steadier now, his eyes more alert. Aveline had used most of her good healing prayer on him first. Gothera hadn't objected. He'll live, Aveline said finally. The ribs are cracked, but nothing vital was damaged. He'll need rest, lots of rest. And me? Gothera's voice was thick with pain. You'll live too. Probably. Maybe. If you're careful and don't do anything stupid like fight trained soldiers with dislocated shoulders. Aveline tried to smile. Failed. You need weeks to heal. You have about 3 days before they realize what happened and send hunters. Then I'd better move fast. Where will you go? Guthera looked toward the dark tunnel that would lead her beyond the fortress walls. North, into the mountains. There are orc clans there. Some might take me in. Some might kill me for abandoning mine. Either way, it's better than here. Aveline handed her a pack filled with supplies. There's food for a week, bandages, some coin that won't be traced, and she reached into her cloak and pulled out the bell from Ember's collar. She'd removed it to treat his injuries. I thought you might want this. As a reminder, Guthera took the small bronze bell in her massive hand. It looked impossibly delicate against her green skin. The dent from Lennox's kick was still there, making it ring slightly off-key. Reminder of what? Guthera asked quietly. That even in the darkest places, small acts of kindness matter. That innocence exists. That someone, somewhere, will choose to be gentle when the whole world tells them to be cruel. Guthera closed her hand around the bell. And what will you remember, sister? Aveline looked at her. Really looked at her. Saw not a monster, not an orc, not a killer, but a person who'd endured months of cruelty and only broke when someone hurt something innocent. I'll remember that justice and revenge aren't always the same thing, that sometimes the bravest thing isn't enduring, it's saying no more, and that Captain Lennox died because he couldn't imagine a world where his actions had consequences. She helped Guthera to her feet. Go, run, survive, and if you find others who were hurt by people like him, tell them they're not alone. Tell them someone stood up. Tell them it's possible. Guthera nodded. She looked at Ember one last time. The cat's eyes were closed now, his breathing peaceful. He'd survived. That was something. Thank you, Guthera said. The words sounded foreign in her mouth. She hadn't said them in so long. For helping him. For helping me. For being kind when you had no reason to be. I had every reason, Aveline replied. Ember showed me that. You showed me that. Kindness doesn't need a reason. It just needs a choice. Guthera turned toward the tunnel. Each step looked like it cost her, but she kept moving. The bell in her hand rang softly with each footfall. Damaged, off-key, but still functioning. Guthera, Aveline called out as the darkness began to swallow the orc's form. Will you be all right? The orc stopped, looked back, and in the dim light, Aveline saw something that looked almost like peace. No, Guthera said honestly, but I'll be alive, and sometimes that has to be enough. Then she was gone, swallowed by shadows and distance, leaving only the faint echo of a damaged bell ringing in the dark. Aveline stood alone in the passage for a long moment. Then she gathered Ember gently in her arms and headed back toward the light. She had a story to prepare, about how she'd found the captain dead, about how she'd seen nothing, about how terrible it was that such violence could happen in a place meant to uphold order. The lies would taste like ash, but they'd keep Ember safe. They'd give Guthera time to run. And sometimes, in a world that punished kindness and rewarded cruelty, a useful lie served truth better than speaking honestly ever could. 3 months later, stories started circulating in taverns along the northern territories. Tales of an orc woman who walked alone through hostile territory, who helped villages defend against bandits without asking for payment, who nursed wounded travelers and never gave her name. Some said she was a ghost, a spirit of vengeance haunting the mountains. Others said she carried a small bronze bell that rang off-key when she moved, though no one could figure out why an orc warrior would carry something so impractical. The stories grew, morphed, changed with each telling, but the core remained the same. Somewhere in the mountains, there was an orc who'd chosen justice over revenge, who'd risked everything for something small and innocent, and who'd survived to prove that even in the darkest moments, choosing kindness over cruelty mattered. Back at the fortress, Sister Aveline continued her rounds, brought food to prisoners, showed them small acts of humanity in a place designed to strip humanity away. And every evening, when she finished her work, she'd return to her quarters where Ember waited. Healed now, his ribs mended, his orange fur as bright as autumn leaves. She'd removed the bell from his collar. Too painful a memory, too much of a reminder of what had been broken that night. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she'd take the bell out from where she kept it wrapped in cloth. She'd hold it, listen to its off-key ring, and she'd remember that one person standing up had mattered. That justice, even imperfect justice, even justice that cost everything, was better than letting cruelty pass unchallenged. That sometimes the smallest acts, feeding a prisoner, befriending a cat, showing kindness when the world demanded cruelty, could change everything. Ember would curl up beside her on those nights, purring his small contentment, unaware that he'd been the catalyst for something larger, that his innocence had shown a warrior that some things were worth fighting for beyond survival, that his friendship had proven that connection mattered even in the deepest darkness. The last anyone heard of Guthara was a year later. A merchant traveling through the northern passes reported seeing her at the edge of an orc settlement. She was helping rebuild homes damaged by winter storms, working alongside orcs and humans who'd formed an unlikely community in the mountains. She still carried the bell, the merchant said, wore it on a cord around her neck. When asked about it, she'd simply said, "It reminds me that small things matter, that gentleness is a choice, and that choosing it, even once, can change the course of a life." The merchant hadn't understood, but he remembered the story anyway, retelling it in taverns and markets, spreading it like a seed that might someday grow into something larger. Back in her cell, now empty, chains still hanging from the wall where she'd torn them free, a different prisoner sat in the darkness. He'd been there 2 weeks, was already starting to forget what hope felt like. Then he heard it, the soft chime of a bronze bell. Ember walked into the thin moonlight, his tail high, his purr already starting. He rubbed against the bars like he'd found exactly what he was looking for. And somewhere in the mountains, Guthara felt the ghost of that purr across her chest and smiled. Some bonds, she'd learned, couldn't be broken by distance or time. Some friendships were too strong for chains. And sometimes the smallest creatures taught the greatest warriors what it really meant to be brave. The bell around her neck rang softly as she worked, off-key and damaged, but still singing. A reminder that even broken things could still make music if they chose to keep ringing. If you enjoyed this story of impossible friendship and the courage to choose justice, please like this video and subscribe to Orc-Bound Tales for more emotional fantasy stories that challenge what it means to be human, or orc. Drop a comment telling me, would you have made the same choice as Guthara? What would you risk for someone who showed you kindness? Your thoughts matter to this community we're building. See you in the next tale, where we'll discover that sometimes the monsters in the story aren't the ones we expect.